Hi, welcome to DCC.
Hi.
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 Hey.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Leslie Dominy,
I'm Brian Rogers.
and we have the pleasure of serving on the guest services team here at DCC.
On behalf of everyone at DCC, we just want to say that we're happy that you joined us today.
Good morning, DCC. We're so excited to see you this morning online, and we're so excited to know as a band to be together. We're up here at our rehearsal space, and I'm excited to sing with you this morning as we just focus our time and gather together to learn something about God and just really be in His presence today. And we're going to sing this amazing song talking about God being our living hope. He really is. In the world that we live in, broken and sinful and full of sickness and hard times, God really is our only hope. And so as you are with your family or friends gathering on your sofa or in a family room somewhere, we just invite you to listen. You're welcome to sing along. The lyrics will be on the screen for you. And just enjoy this time of hearing from what God wants to share with you this morning through this song. How great the chasm that lay between us, how high the mountain I could not climb. In desperation, I turned to heaven and spoke your name into the night. Then through the darkness, your loving kindness tore through the shadows of my soul. The work is finished, the end is written. Jesus Christ, my living hope. Who could imagine such great a mercy? What heart could fathom such boundless grace? The God of ages stepped down from glory to wear my sin of the silence, the roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Then came the morning that sealed the promise. Your buried body began to breathe out of the silence. The roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Jesus, yours is the victory. Oh, hallelujah. Praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah. Death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Hallelujah. Praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah. Death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Jesus Christ, my living hope. God, you are my living hope.
Good morning, Dulles family. If you don't know me, my name is Steve Pasquale, and I'm happy to be here hosting you today. On behalf of our leadership team here at church, I would like to welcome you. It's hard to put into words what this church family means to our leadership team here, as everyone tries to manage through this difficult time. We know this time for many is an inconvenience, while for others, it's a really scary time, or a lonely time, or just a really challenging time to try to work from home. Some of you may be out of work at this time, also very difficult for people to deal with. More than anything else today, I want to express how much you are loved. Even if you're new to DCC during this pandemic and have not had the chance to meet with us in person, we care about you and we are weathering this storm with you. You are not alone. If we don't have your email address, we promise that we won't send you a lot of extra digital content. Please, instead, we'd like to keep you up to date with what Brad and the others are encouraging us during the week or about upcoming events. You can easily share your email address with us by clicking the connect button below or by emailing office@dulleschurch.org. If you're able to give to support the work of DCC, please do. Scripture tells us that financial giving to our church keeps our hands open rather than clutched, and we thank you for your generosity. And finally, on Tuesday nights, there's been laughter and stories and a really great weekly short study on how the book of Jonah is so relevant to our lives today. It's okay to stay muted if you prefer to listen in. The weekly Hang with Brads is 30 minutes every Tuesday night from 8 to 8:30 p.m. Welcome to DCC. Sit back, relax, and get ready for a message that I believe is going to speak to all of us.
Okay, Dulles, change of plans. I have been really excited and pretty passionate is the word the past couple of weeks to launch this new series I mentioned. I'm calling it The Battle for Peace, and it's based on Urban McManus's book that came out last year. It is one of my favorite books in recent memory. And I just want to spend a minute here at the beginning of today to talk about this, and then I'll explain the change of plans. I have for a couple of weeks now, as this storm that we've been talking about has just become protracted, and it seems to be getting longer and longer, and now we're talking not weeks out, but we're talking months out about things that might be closed or may not reopen till the fall or till January. And it's just been growing in my spirit. I think the uncertainty that we're dealing with right now. The weather's nice finally here in the Dulles area. You know, I think on Friday it hit 86 or 87, and it's starting to feel like summer. We've had a warmer weekend. That's helping. Some states are reopening, and you know, there's definitely hope, and there's hope in the air, but there's also a lot of question. And the medical community seems to be evolving on this, just like you know the political world is. And I'm not interested in casting blame. I'm really not. I think people should be held accountable, and that's all fine. I just think it's way too early for any of that. So I'll get back to that in just a little bit. But in this environment of this protracted, this lengthening storm, where uncertainty is really settling in, and we're getting, you know, word and studies are being done around the country and around the world about depression and anxiety. I mean, it was already high in recent years. I mean, it may be at the highest level ever on planet Earth right now because of all the questions and the isolation and just everything going on. I really felt deep in my soul that this book, The Way of the Warrior, is something that we should spend time in as a community. So I know it's my job to promote the new series, and I know it's my job to encourage you every week to invite a friend. And that can almost sound like a cliche. So I'm going to challenge you at the start of this week's message. I know this isn't like jump into a fun story at the start here, but I just feel so strongly about what we're going to begin next week together, that we're supposed to be including others with us, that you are supposed to be a voice and influence to the experience that we're going to have with God. I'm so passionate that that's what's going to happen. We are going to encounter God in a really meaningful, profound, life-impacting way in the coming weeks. And I believe others are supposed to join with us. So regardless if you're physically in the Dulles area or if you're on the West Coast or New England and just wherever you're watching us from, we consider you part of the Dulles family. So I'm going to challenge all of you. You're all included in this. We have the coming 6 days, you and I, to be thinking about who that friend, that neighbor, that coworker, family member who's struggling with the uncertainty, who's struggling with the stress or the anxiety of what's happening right now, the new normal we're living in, this new world we're in, and to extend an invitation to really tell them, hey, I think you should be part of this series with us, just from home. Get coffee the same time as me and just sit in front of your TV or in front of your computer and watch along with us. I really, really believe we're supposed to be mindful to God, thinking as influencers. Who are we supposed to bring along with us in this journey of hope? Okay? Now, the reason for the change of plans. I believe good leaders should plan well, but should also be flexible. And I just think it was God's Spirit. I really do. I wasn't settled with how we closed out the All in the Boat series. But beyond that, I felt God in this season of uncertainty and how long the storm has become, really directing me to Paul's story. We've spent a lot of time in recent weeks, the past month and a half or so, with Peter and the disciples in different boat stories, but we haven't talked about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was in a boat, and a pretty dramatic boat story in Acts chapter 27. And so by Monday or Tuesday, I just felt like, you know what, we need one more week in this series all in the same boat. So students who are watching and joining us today, if you're a student, I want to give you an assignment right now. Will you do this for me? I have not had the chance yet to look at any hurricane forecast. So would you guys, and you know, I don't care if you start right now or later, would you do some research for me? Will you see what's being forecasted for this year's hurricane season? I know forecasts are already coming out. I heard a little bit about them, but I don't know anything about them. So I'm asking just any of our students, would you be kind of like my research department? And I can explain that more later. And it kind of relates to the story actually in Acts 27, where the Apostle Paul, when we are introduced to the Apostle Paul, he's not an apostle. In fact, he's very antagonistic against the church. He is murdering, executing followers of Jesus. And we don't have an exact count, but we know it's many, many people that Paul, in his Roman authority, is putting to death because of their new faith in Jesus. And then he has his own profound experience with Jesus. It's dramatic, earlier in this story of Acts, in this book of Acts. And it changes everything. It changes Paul's worldview. It changes not only his theology, but his behavior. He becomes a person of hope. And so now he's building the church. And he's been on 3 missionary journeys, starting churches, building the church, preaching about the love and life-changing experience that he's had with Jesus. And he has now been arrested for it. The Roman government has arrested Paul for preaching about Jesus. And now he's leaving in Palestine, the city of Caesarea, to go to Rome to stand trial. And the quickest way to Rome from Palestine, from really modern-day Israel, is across the Mediterranean Sea. And all of our stories have been boat stories. This is really a ship story. There's 276 passengers, and actually, I'm not even going to call them passengers. Most of the people on this ship are actually not passengers, they're prisoners. And Paul boards this ship in chains as a prisoner. 2 of his companions are allowed to go along with him. The writer of Acts is Luke, the Apostle Luke, and Aristarchus is a friend and companion of Paul's too, and they both were told early here in the story, board the ship with Paul. Okay, so let's jump in. Acts 27, verse 1. When it was decided that now this is Luke writing the story of Acts, but telling of Paul's story. So when he says we, he's talking about himself, Luke, Aristarchus, and Paul. When it was decided that we would set sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. This was very common in Jesus' day in the Roman Empire, that when a famed or well-known prisoner was being transported, the Roman officials would assign a centurion to escort the prisoner, much like today, an FBI agent or someone in law enforcement would actually travel with on a plane, a prisoner, someone of high profile. So Paul has a lot of attention here. He's well-known, and that's why he's been assigned this personal escort. Okay, so they're on their way to Rome across the Mediterranean Sea. And in verse 9, I'm going to skip ahead to verse 9. There's been a lot of detail about the particular coast and beaches and towns that they sail to, the bays that they harbor in, that they anchor in. There's explicit detail about the story, which I'll mention again here in just a minute. So in verse 9, much time had been lost because they lost wind for a couple days and were just sitting in a dead calm. So they got behind, and they're right at the edge of storm season, which is why that's relevant. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because of the season and how they've been delayed now in their journey. So Paul warned them. He warns the sailors, and really many on the ship, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot, really the captain of the ship, and the owner of the ship. The centurion just kind of blows off what Paul's saying here, that he's sensing, God's giving him an awareness that we are headed into disaster if we continue in this journey. The centurion blows that off, and this is all about profit and money, of course. It's interesting that some Bible scholars tell us that this story that we're about to read in Acts 27 is the most well-documented New Testament story outside of the biblical text. In history, in documents, in writings, there is much in history that speaks to this story. We have a lot of detail that corroborates Luke's account of this story of Acts 27, of the coming shipwreck. I want to read a portion. This is just interesting, and you may find this interesting. This is from an article about the historicity of the story. This account is supported by a wealth of historical detail. No other passage in the New Testament has such a striking evidential confirmation of its historical accuracy. Not only are the political, social, and legal details of the voyage and shipwreck striking in their accuracy, but also the meteorological and nautical details. It's interesting that there's a lot that's said and written about in history about what we're going to look at. One of the first takeaways here, everybody, is that Paul ends up in the storm that we're about to read about, not by his doing. This is not because he's been sloppy. It's not because he's taken his eyes off of God. It's actually because he's been speaking about God and God's love and the reality of Jesus. Paul is about to be thrown into the chaos of this storm against his will. And it just, makes me pause here for a second to think about how that's happened to you and me, when that's happened to you and me. Times where you're just thrown into a mess or chaos, not by your own doing, maybe because of someone else's behavior or someone else's actions, or maybe just because of life. And here Paul is going into this storm very much against what he would prescribe for his own life or his own plan. That's kind of the setup to what I think God wants to challenge you and me about today in this story. Verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, and that's really the end of the calm before the storm. We go quickly here into this ferocious storm. When the gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, meaning they finally have wind. They've just been sitting still in the Mediterranean Sea now for a while, and it's made them delayed, and it's pushed them closer to storm season. So they see their opportunity. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the nor'easter swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted the lifeboat aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship. I didn't even know this is something that could happen until the biblical story. When I read this in Acts, they are so worried that the ship is going to break apart, they actually get ropes all the way around underneath of it and tighten these ropes to try to hold the ship together in the storm. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. So this thing's being driven in this fierce wind, and the anchor's just being dragged along the sea bottom. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day, this goes on for more than a day and more than a night. Now we're into the next day. The next day, the sailors began to throw the cargo overboard. So this is like desperation. On the third day, and just, a week ago when I was feeling like, maybe this series isn't over yet, we need to spend some time in Paul's story. It's the first time I really stopped and paused on this. The third day, this is a prolonged storm. Some of us think of storms, the lightning strikes and the thunder and the rain is driving for a couple hours, and then we'll tell each other, wow, that was a pretty crazy storm. And then sometimes it's like all evening or through the night. Now they're into the third day, verse 19. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many more days past the third day, they're seeing none of the sky, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. First of all, it's hurricane force winds. They call it a nor'easter. Some of our worst winters here in the Dulles area, in the mid-Atlantic, some of the worst winter storms or blizzards are nor'easters. These ocean-driven storms that, go from Florida right up our coast, and some of our snowstorms that have the biggest snowdrifts are, from nor'easters. That's what they're dealing with here, and it's like relentless, like it's just not stopping. You ever find yourself in a storm that just seems like it's just not ending? It just won't end? Maybe you've been in a relationship storm where the stress just went on and on. The anxiety of a financial loss or financial threat. I think for a lot of us, what we're dealing with right now is maybe starting to feel like this. 2 weeks of quarantine, that was hard enough. The president said at one point, I think we'll reopen by Easter. That feels like a year ago. I think it's starting to settle in on us, even as the weather's getting better and some things are starting to open up. We're not sure if places are opening too soon. Some people want to see us open faster. Some want to see us open slower. With all that's happening, I think we could all agree that we are settled into a protracted, really long, seemingly never-ending storm. So I want to ask you, have you been in a storm? I'm going to ask you about a time when you found yourself in a storm that seemed to just never end. It's like there's no quit to this stress or this anxiety. Maybe it's been a relationship storm. Maybe it's been financial. I think for all of us, this quarantine and this virus and being shut down has become maybe the storm. That's really what this whole series has been about. But I think we can all agree it's just not ending. It just doesn't seem to be ending. We all have differences of opinion about what should be opening. And, like I said, the weather's been nicer and there's hope in the air. There's some parts opening. Some feel the country's opening too soon, and some feel like it's not opening fast enough. What I know for sure that we all agree with, where we're all on the same page, where we're all in the same boat, is that this storm has been longer than any of us believed it would be in the beginning. What do you do in a storm that seems to just have no quit, just not end? How do you look at the future? What are the words that come out of your mouth? Do you start assigning blame? Who do you blame when you're in a never-ending storm? More to say about that in just a minute. This text we just read goes on to say, and this is Luke writing, that after days of after throwing the cargo overboard, they reached the point, he says, where we finally gave up all hope of being saved. What are storms like for you when you get to the point of maybe giving up all hope? I think that's kind of settling into our country right now. Now, maybe that's extreme. Some of you would say, well, I haven't given up all hope. A lot of people are struggling right now with how to look at the future. How do you look at the future when you've lost hope? What are the words that come out of your mouth when you've lost hope? What is your voice? What does your voice sound like when you've lost hope? Who do you blame when you've lost hope? I'll tell you, I know what it is to feel like I've been thrown into a storm against my will or by someone else. I know what it is to feel like I want to set the record straight, or I want to be vocal, or I want to see justice. I want to tell my side of the story. We have this reaction waiting in us when we find ourselves in some chaos that we would say is very much against our own planning or our own will. Who do you blame? How do you behave? What does your voice sound like when you find yourself in a relentless storm that just seems to go on and just never end? I want to say something here about where we are as a country. I had hoped in the beginning of this crisis that it would pull us together. We've been really divided politically. And some would say for 3 years. I think the political division goes back longer than that. And, I might be about to lose friends when I say this. Maybe we'll lose church members and people joining us because of what I'm about to say. I steer clear of using this platform to make political points. I always have and I always will. And I'm afraid that what I'm about to say is going to sound like I'm violating that by taking some kind of political position. I am making the point, and I'm going to say what I'm about to, because of the way of Jesus. I have been trying to temper some political passion among friends and in my own home recently. And the political passion is in me too. I've mentioned this a couple weeks ago. I have my own political passions and convictions. There is a growing discipline in me when I am quiet before God that is telling me in this relentless storm, don't become just more of the rhetoric. Don't put my energy into saying what I think is wrong politically and who's to blame for this. And listen, if you think that I'm directing this at you because of a recent conversation we've had, I've had this week probably 20 or more conversations with various people about the government's response and the CDC. And listen, I'm not thinking of a person. I commit that to you. But I'm concerned about the division that is just reaching a fever pitch right now. And I'm going to just give you an anecdotal story. And this is the one that I'm afraid may lose people, or people think I'm taking some political position here. In this storm, when the winds were beginning to lightly blow, let's say, like we read in verse 9, President Trump gave a press conference back, I think it was late February, and he said something that just made me pause the TV. He said that he was closing flights from China into the United States because of the coronavirus. And I thought it seemed extreme. I went up the steps. Amy wasn't interested in watching. And I said, Trump just closed flights from China. And it just felt extreme to me. And the next day in the news, I heard other people saying the same thing. I even heard some people call him racist for it. Listen, what has happened in our country has been evolving for everyone. I don't believe anybody should have had this figured out in January or in February. Fauci at one point said, a couple weeks before we closed down, Anthony Fauci said, I don't think the impact in America is going to be very great. You know, when I saw that, I don't know, several weeks ago now, it's just like, wow, so much has changed. I don't fault him for that. Nancy Pelosi stood in Chinatown here in D.C., encouraging people just a couple weeks before our shutdown, please come to Chinatown, fill our restaurants, let's fill our streets. I don't fault Donald Trump, our president, for closing down China. I thought it was extreme when he did it. I think we've become contradictory in a lot of ways in our political passions because we're trying to assign blame. And the easiest place to attribute blame is to the other side. We're so quick at it. We're so good at this. And we've done it in the storms that seem relentless or never ending in marriage crisis and in financial crisis. We just start looking. It's our human default to look for someone to blame. Who can I blame this on? I believe in accountability. I believe political officials can be and should be held accountable. I just think all of that comes later. We should be pulling together right now. And if our country can't do it as a whole, may it start with you and me. May we become the voice that we're about to read in the Apostle Paul, in this remarkable story, the voice that he becomes. Because my question for you is, who does Paul blame as this storm intensifies and goes past the first day and evening into the next day and then day 3, and then after day 3, many more days of no sunlight or sky, they begin throwing the tackle overboard. And Luke himself says, when they'd lost all hope in being saved. When you and I feel uncertainty about the future, or about whether schools are going to open when, or whether businesses should be or shouldn't be, or states or governors are getting, and we get so passionate. And I'm not trying to temper passion. I believe that we should be a country that can protest or voice our opinions. I do. I really believe that. But we're so quick to assign blame when we should be voices of hope. And I think we get that mixed up sometimes. And political viewpoints take precedent. Listen, I've had to temper, even in my own house here, that I think we owe it to the God who calls us to pray for our president to be praying for our president right now. I am one that thought it was extreme to close to China, and then it seems that so much of the country felt like he shouldn't have done that, but now he should have done things differently before then. And I know this is starting to sound political. I'm not intending to defend or promote any side here. If you lean left or you lean right, I'm calling you and me to lean toward the still small voice of the Spirit of God in us, who says, let's be people of hope. Let's be voices of hope to the people around us who find themselves swirling in the howling winds of uncertainty. In this relentless storm that seems to just not be ending, let's be voices of hope It doesn't mean we lose our political voice or our political opinions. It just means before we bash or critique or analyze or cast blame, we become the voice of God to people who need hope. Have you noticed in this story who Paul blames? Paul walks onto the ship in chains as a prisoner and is thrown into the storm very much against his will. Who's Paul blaming? Let's keep reading. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them, before the sailors and the prisoners. He said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." That's like the good news comes before the bad news. The bad news is this ship is going to be destroyed. That's how bad this storm is. And Paul goes on to say that God has given him insight into what's happening. And even back at Crete, God's Spirit was prompting Paul, this is not going to be pretty. We are going into an ugly, ugly storm. The bad news is the ship in this story is going to be lost, but not a single one of you is going to lose their lives, Paul says. So have courage. While Paul is pointing out why they should be listening to him, he doesn't cast blame. He doesn't waste his time casting blame. They're in the middle of a violent storm. The storm hasn't lessened at all at this point. They're still in the middle of this nor'easter. Paul decides to put his energy into the inner prompting of God's voice of what everyone needs to hear. I think if anyone had the right in a prolonged, stress-filled storm that seemed to never end, it would be the Apostle Paul, who was imprisoned, arrested and imprisoned for speaking about God's love in a land that didn't allow it. If anybody has the right to cast blame or to cry for justice, I think it would be Paul. Instead, Paul becomes the compass in the storm. Paul becomes the singular compass in this violent, raging storm. We go on. Last night, an angel of the Lord, this is Paul speaking, spoke and prompted God's Spirit into him to tell the people to have courage. This is a bad storm, and the ship will be wrecked, but no one will lose a hair off of their head, he goes on to say. So keep up your courage. Men, keep up your courage, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. I don't know what the storm's effect has had on you, and I don't know what it will have on you in the days or weeks ahead, or even the months ahead. Thank God we'll be able to be outside more, of course, but listen, this is weighing on not just our country, this is our whole globe. I've said it in week 1, rarely is the whole world in the same storm at the same time. I don't know what the effects are on you, but I know that human nature and our tendency is to react and put our energy into casting blame. I'll tell you what the people around you need right now. The people around you in your sphere of influence need a compass. They need a voice that is speaking God's hope in God's life. If some need to be held accountable later, let's deal with that later. I'm just right now not casting blame at the CDC for not having this figured out, or the FDA, or the White House, or the Democrats. It's just not the time in a storm. We should be pulling together. And if the people around you can't do that, if the people around you are going to argue and scream about the quarantine and when we open up states and when we open up schools, I believe we should have opinions, and it matters when our kids go to school, very much so. But I believe what the people around you and me need more than anything right now is the compass of God's voice and God's hope and God's love. Paul probably thought about giving up hope himself, but he kept listening to the Spirit of God. And that's what this whole series has been about. Recognizing the presence of Jesus in the boat, Jesus, how can you be sleeping at a time like this? Don't you care if we're going to drown, the disciples said? And the lesson that they were going to learn in that boat story was when you have the presence of Jesus with you, storms are just really not that stormy. They just don't have their power and potency when the creator of the wind and waves is with you, when you're in the presence of God. Jesus goes on in the other boat stories to explain, you just not only need my presence, you need my words. Just lean into me, and everything will be as God has forecast on the other side. You will be life givers. You will be encouragers. You will be hope fillers when we get to the other side of the sea. Paul says in verse 25, so keep your courage, men, for I have faith in God. And if everyone around you is losing faith, if everyone around you has lost all hope, if people around you are battling anxiety and discouragement, listen to the voice of God, listen to the words of Jesus, and be the compass of courage and hope, the call to courage. That God, somebody asked me a couple weeks ago, Brad, could something like this, if not this virus, could a future virus just end the world? Could we, and it was a serious question, and I'm not mocking the question at all. It was asked of me seriously, could something like this wipe out humanity? And I said, no, it's impossible, because my faith in God tells me that the future that we're moving toward, to the other side of the sea, is a future where God's church becomes what he always intended it to be, not a place of political debate and division, and not a place of self-righteousness where we act and pretend as if we are something that belittles others. That's what a lot of church history has been. The church will become, Scripture says, the glory of God. We will become the attractive, creative place of beauty on planet Earth that shows the reality of God. I know that's going to happen. I don't believe a virus can wipe out planet Earth, because God has promised that that is what his church is going to become. And that was my answer to this person, and they found courage. They sort of reacted like relieved. If the people around you who are losing all hope aren't hearing the voice of God, that's okay. Don't judge them for that. You be the one who leans into the words of God, and you be the voice of courage. You be the compass in the storm. Verse 27, this just froze me in my seat a week or two ago when I read this. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed that we were approaching land. And this just goes on in dramatic storytelling by Luke here. On the 14th night, I've read this story, I sat just like paralyzed, like, wow, in stories of being at sea, this is like forever. This has been an eternity, in a nor'easter for 14 nights. We are living in a time where anxiety and depression are really starting to take hold. And people are so concerned about the jobless rates, and just on Friday, Thursday or Friday, just a couple days ago, another 3 million people filed for unemployment. I mean, we've never seen anything like this in the United States. And if we're not hearing the voice of God, the voice of panic can seize our hearts and souls so quickly. I'm not judging people around me if they don't have courage. I get it. I have my own bouts. Amy said last week in the interview, she really struggled that week before, just battling her own sense of courage for a couple of days. I've battled that myself. My answer isn't to try to muster up something fake and put on a happy face. My answer is to lean into the promises of God, the presence of God, the power of God, and what he is saying about our future. And if you don't have the courage right now, then just let my courage encourage your hearts that God has a future for us. He is taking us through the storm to the other side. But beyond you being encouraged today and watching along in this, which I hope you are, I just want to call you to become the courage in your world. become the voice of hope, become the compass in the never-ending storm. I want to just make sure I don't miss any important things here that just to wrap this up. Don't disengage from others because you're so focused. To save time here, some of the sailors deceptively try to get off the ship when they think they're near land. The sailors want to escape and get away because they think the ship is going to sink and everyone will die. So they pretend, they're letting down the lifeboat, pretending in the story to be doing something with the ropes. And Paul notices. Paul somehow, as the prisoner, notices, and he calls the centurions and the officials on the ship to not allow them, that this ship will sink and everyone will die if we don't have these sailors. And it just brought to mind that it's so easy to just disengage from everyone when we are in our own storm. I know that's the temptation, to think about our own finances, our own job situation, our own anxiety, the winds that are howling around us right now. Just right now, I just need to focus on my kids and on my house and on my future. And I'm telling you, that's actually a formula for heading towards a shipwreck. Part of the answer of God, part of the freedom of God, part of actually hearing the voice of God is in becoming people who are willing to be the voice of hope to others. That takes discipline and it takes sacrifice, but it is part of what God's calling us to. And I feel so compelled to end the series all in the same boat, asking us, challenging us, calling all of us here at DCC. I don't care if you live in California or Arizona or Connecticut or Florida, wherever you are joining us from, that you be in the same boat with us, that we become people passionately convinced that God is a God of answers and has hope, real hope for our future. And he uses storms to shape us and to humble us toward him and his ways and his power. Don't disengage right now because your own storm is swirling. Have the courage to listen to God's hope, not just for yourself, but for others, and be the compass in someone else's storm. I love you, DCC. I hope you don't hear me preaching at you, but speaking with you. I'm with you in this boat. I need your encouragement. And while I'm at it, let me just say, please encourage us. You guys see me on Sundays. I don't get to see a lot of you. Your encouragement, so many of you have encouraged us, and we've loved it. And it's just been like medicine to the soul. Encourage others. We have serious needs happening around us right now in our faith community. Be available to be the voice of hope and the voice of life. Not because you're just making it up or you're trying to fake something that's encouraging, but because you've heard God. And if you haven't been listening to God, don't feel guilty. Don't sign off from this feeling guilty. That's okay. We all do it. We've all had seasons where we tune God out because we're washing our own nets while Jesus is trying to speak to us. Just get in the boat with Jesus, carve out time, make part of your morning, part of your evening, a time where you can hear what God's saying. What has God been saying to you in this series? What is God saying to you right now in Scripture? Let that spill over to the people in your world. We're starting a series next week, The Battle for Peace. It's based on Erwin McManus's book, The Way of the Warrior. It is one of my favorite books in recent memory. It is going to be life-impacting. I am honored to call him really a pastor unofficially. I say that Erwin is my pastor. He has guided me and my family here in recent years in a number of really, really encouraging ways where he has heard the Spirit of God. He was listening to God's Spirit. I think much like Paul was in this ship when he wrote The Way of the Warrior. And we're going to just kind of treat this like a book reading series where I'm going to pull out some of my favorite parts and we're going to unpack it together. Invite a friend. You've got the next 6 days to influence a neighbor, a coworker, a friend who's struggling with the uncertainty of this new world. And I'm just challenging you to have the courage, be the compass, even if just enough to say, hey, watch church with me because we're talking about finding real peace in this new world we find ourselves in. I love you guys. I love doing church with you. I love doing life with you. I'll see you online this week.